Welcome to the podcast on the other economic indicators. This podcast is meant to be viewed after the podcast on the three main economic indicators: GDP, inflation, and unemployment. While there are many other economic indicators in addition to the main ones, only three of these other indicators will be discussed in this podcast. These three are the Consumer Confidence Index, new housing starts, and the poverty rate. I'm starting with the Consumer Confidence Index, or CCI. This indicator measures exactly what you might think it does. It measures consumers' confidence in the economy, as well as how those consumers are currently doing. It is an important indicator for economists to look at because people react based on what they think they are experiencing now and what they think they will experience in the future. Individuals differ on what they think income stability looks like, but as long as an individual believes he has income stability, it will affect his current and future actions accordingly. Therefore, as long as people have confidence they are or will be economically well off, they are more likely to spend more money and vice versa. Thus, businesses and the government look to consumer confidence to help predict people's spending habits, what and how much to produce, and how much to charge. Here is a graph of consumer confidence. This graph shows present situation, expectations, and then a combination of the two, which is the Consumer Confidence Index. The higher consumer confidence is, the better off people probably are, and vice versa. However, you can see that during the Great Recession, consumer confidence fell. It took a while for consumer confidence to recover, even as the economy began to recover. This graph essentially shows the same data as the other graph, just over a longer range of time. However, it also clarifies the relationship between consumer confidence and recessions. The red dips on the bottom are recessions. Again, it enables us to see that when recessions occur, consumer confidence takes a big hit and people become more concerned for what the future holds for them economically. The next of the other economic indicators discussed in this podcast will be new housing starts. It simply means the amount of new houses that are being built. When an economy is doing well, people tend to buy homes. This indicator is important because homes are among the most expensive purchases people make. If people have enough money to buy homes, then they have enough money to buy other goods and services. Even if not everyone can afford a house, if more people can afford to buy a new house, then we can assume more people can afford to buy new cars and new televisions. Thus, every consumer industry can assume that people will increase spending habits. Not only this, but an increase in new housing starts also means an increase in the materials used in the production of the houses, such as lumber, and that provides jobs to other people. This graph shows new housing starts from 2008 to 2019. This graph shows that housing starts dropped during the Great Recession, but have eventually increased since then. This is in line with how the economy did in the decade after the recession. Note here that we expect the up and down throughout the years because more houses are built during the warmer months rather than the cooler ones. This graph shows the same new housing starts, but for a wider range of time. The gray areas also represent the recessions we've had in the US since 1965. Notice that the new housing tends to decrease sometime during a recession. It doesn't always happen right away, as building new housing takes planning, and sometimes it's better just to finish a new housing development than scrap it. Regardless, you can still see the general trend. The last of the other economic indicators that we'll discuss in this podcast is the poverty rate. The poverty rate is the percentage of Americans who have an income below a certain level. The poverty line is a minimum income that changes based on the number of adults and children living in the household. If a family makes under this minimum income, they are considered to be living in poverty. If they are above, they are not considered to be in poverty. The poverty rate is theoretically a minimum level of income that people can live on. This is theoretical because, like other indicators, it has some flaws. The most important being that the poverty line is set very low, and without government help in the form of safety nets, it can be argued that it's not really an adequate amount to live on. Thus, many feel the poverty line needs to be set higher. That is up for debate, though. Regardless, it is an important indicator because it does indeed reflect the standard of living in an area. The The standard of living is basically how comfortably a person can live. The fewer people in poverty, the more people in theory who are living comfortably. It is also important because when poverty rates rise, it can signify that action needs to be taken to help those individuals, or even individuals who live a little bit above the poverty line. Here is a chart that shows what the U.S. poverty line is as of 2015. In theory, the government has set it so that a person under 65 who lives alone can live on just over $12,000 a year. It also shows that a family of 4 with 2 children would be in poverty if their family income is $24,035 a year or less. The poverty line does not currently take cost of living into consideration. Cost of living means how much more or less than the average cost it is to live in a certain area. For example, it is more expensive to live in New York City than rural South Dakota. Fortunately, poverty rates have dropped since 1960, but unfortunately, they more or less remained between 10 and 15% of the U.S. population from 1965 onwards. This is a closer look at the poverty rates from 1990 to 2016. Looking more closely, it is easier to tell that poverty rates seem to increase towards the end and right after recessions. This is because getting out of poverty takes time. During recessions, wages sometimes decrease, and it takes a little time for wages to start increasing again, keeping people in poverty a little bit longer. It also takes some time for new jobs to be created after a recession, causing the same result. Unfortunately, child poverty in the U.S. has traditionally been much higher, never having gone below 16%. However, child poverty rates since the recession have decreased by a few percentage points despite remaining high. This slide is important because it doesn't only show the poverty rates on the bottom of the graph, which was 14.5% in 2013, but it also shows the number of actual people living in poverty since 1959. Unfortunately, even though the poverty rate has been decreasing, the number of people in poverty has been rising. The reason for this is because of population increases. Thus, as of 2013, 45.3 million Americans lived in poverty. That's quite a large number. While there are a large number of people living in poverty, the rates vary by state. The darker the color on the map, the more people living in poverty. As you can see, the Deep South is one of the most impoverished areas of the United States. Remember, though, this doesn't take cost of living into account. When cost of living is taken into account, poverty looks a bit different. For example, New York and California are very expensive to live in, so while not as many people as a percentage of the population may be officially living in poverty, their financial issues are just as dire. This is in contrast to other areas where it's cheaper to live and thus people can live more comfortably with a lower income. While I could have discussed these indicators even more in depth, especially poverty, this podcast has provided you with an overview of some of the other economic indicators that help economists to determine how an economy and a country as a whole is doing. Thanks for listening.